This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Hey, aren't you that PBM?
Middleman, at your service, doctor.
Don't you get rebates that save money on medicines?
Oh, PBMs like me get big rebates.
So why do patients tell me they're worried about their costs?
No one says we have to share the savings with patients.
Congress should make sure medicine savings go directly to patients, not middlemen. Visit phrma.org/middlemen to learn more. Paid for by pharma.
Molly, can you describe the scene on opening day for a grocery store in Illinois called Rise? If I were there, what would I see?
To me, it was a magical moment that day.
Molly Parker is an investigative reporter for Capital News Illinois and a local reporting network fellow at ProPublica.
There were balloons, and the lieutenant governor was down, and she was wearing this lovely yellow dress, and everybody was just in a good mood. That's what I remember. It was like, this just felt good, because so often I was going there for situations to cover news that I thought was very important, but was often not happy.
And you wrote that people were holding up signs. What did the signs say?
That's right. They had a chant at one point. It reminded me of a football rally, cheerleaders at a football rally, and they would one at a time hold them up, and it said, "We are no longer a food desert." And that's a big statement to make, right? Like, we are no longer a food desert is something they wanted people clearly to know, because that's a stigma, and it's something they wanted to reverse. And it was important to them, I think, to have that out there in a loud kind of way.
We've been having a national conversation about the cost of food, but access to groceries and proximity to them is also crucial. The town of Cairo hadn't had a local grocery store since 2015. So when the Rise Community Market opened in June 2023, with the help of private funding and government grants, people in town were ready to shed that label, a so-called food desert.
It really is a way of describing a place without easy access to a grocery store. And I don't think there's just like one hard definition over what that means. But the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, describes it now as rural towns or rural places without a grocery store within 10 miles and urban neighborhoods within a mile.
Are there patterns as to where food deserts tend to be? Where do we find them?
Probably not surprising. There are places that are distressed. Like, by definition, food deserts or low access areas, whatever the particular government program is going to call them, are places that are low income. So you're going to see them in urban areas that have been hollowed out through redlining and white flight. That's why you'll see that they're far more common, unfortunately, for people of color. And then you see them also in a lot of rural places.
Which is why the federal government has put millions of dollars every year into programs that give communities more access to fresh food. That includes opening new grocery stores, like Rise. But less than 2 years after that triumphant opening day, it's not clear that Rise will survive.
I didn't actually set out to write a story examining these government food desert programs. We were just so excited, along with everyone else, to be honest about it. It was a day that felt good to be a reporter. And as we kept going back, we would notice that, things weren't pretty quickly weren't going as well as you would think for a town that was brought out, several hundred people to a grand opening. And so we just kind of started watching and asking questions like, why is this? And if you look at statistics from the USDA, it just shows that there's been a rash of grocery store closures over the last 20 years.
Today on the show, what it takes to keep a local grocery store alive. I'm Yasmin Khan, in for Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
Planned Parenthood Federation of America exists so that all people can get access to the sexual and reproductive care and education they need to make informed decisions about their health. More than 2 million patients a year rely on the services Planned Parenthood health centers provide, like STI testing and treatment, birth control, gender-affirming care, abortion, cancer screenings, and so much more. Right now, all across the country, reproductive health care and rights are under attack from public officials who are out of step with the will of the vast majority of Americans. The constitutional right to abortion, control of our bodies, and the health care we need has been stolen from us. And now politicians in 47 states, yes, 47, have introduced bills that would block people from getting the sexual and reproductive care they need. Planned Parenthood knows that equitable access to health care, including safe, legal abortion, is a human right. Right now, Planned Parenthood needs your help to protect access to health care. Donate today by visiting plannedparenthood.org/protect.
Support comes from USA for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. People facing war and violence are now facing winter far from home in temporary shelters and with little to keep them warm. As humanitarian needs in Ukraine, Afghanistan, Syria, and beyond increase, ensuring continued funding to help the most vulnerable is more urgent than ever. You can help. Donate today to help keep families safe and warm this winter. UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, works around the clock to support the most vulnerable throughout the year, providing blankets, cash to buy warm clothes, fuel for heaters, and shelter. It's during the winter months that your support makes all the difference. Help protect refugees and people forced to flee as they face winter far from home. Your gift is matched for a limited time. Give now at unrefugees.org/winter.
So over the course of your reporting, you spent a good amount of time in the town of Cairo, which is in the poorest county in Illinois. Going back, say, 2 years ago, how did people in Cairo shop for groceries?
Yeah, I mean, there was a survey done where I want to say most people said they were leaving at least monthly to cross state lines to do their grocery shopping, like the vast majority. There hasn't been a full-service grocery store prior to Rise opening in Cairo since 2015. And that year, their last independent store shut down. So since that time, they would be shopping at mostly out of town, really. I mean, there are $2 Generals in town. And, of course, they have canned goods, some maybe freezer section type stuff. And at the time, the Dollar Generals did not sell any sort of fresh foods in the two Cairo stores. So people mostly were driving 30 miles away. Cairo's sort of right in the middle of, at the border of both Kentucky and Missouri. So people would be going to like Paducah, Kentucky, Cape Girardeau, Missouri. It's like sort of mid-sized towns that had the Walmarts and Kroger's 30 or so miles away in 3 different directions.
I want to take a step back to talk about why grocery stores matter. What is the importance of a grocery store to a community?
Well, it's twofold, right? And it is about convenient access to fresh and affordable food. Having that convenient, again, for people who don't have a car, for people who are elderly, even if you can say, well, some people, it's no big deal for them to drive 30 miles. There are still going to always be like a pretty big segment of people that it is a big deal and it is make or break for them. That's the first thing. The second part of it is that I believe a grocery store is sort of one of the, 3 or 4 elements that make a town versus just like a rural bump in the road. So you got to have a school, you got to have a bank, a grocery store, a gas station, ideally maybe a healthcare center, right? Like you don't have to have everything, but it does feel like a grocery store is one of those key elements to say, yeah, we still have a town here. And if you are trying to grow your town, people come in, developers come in, do I want to put a business here or not? I think that's one of the things they look at too. And groceries are also like the third highest expense for the American household. Behind our housing and our cars, we spend the next most amount of money on groceries. So it's also, if you don't have a grocery store in your own community, all of the money you're spending, which is substantial, even in a small town, is going to other communities, right? Like it's benefiting other communities' tax bases and other communities' employers. So you're not benefiting your own community.
Back in 2011, the federal government began trying to tackle the problem of food deserts in a concerted way. During her husband's presidency, Michelle Obama created the Healthy Food Financing Initiative as an effort to tackle the grocery gap. The concept of the program is straightforward. Use government funds to help build grocery stores, shorten the trek for fresh food, and in the process, make people healthier and bolster the local economy. In the years since, Congress has allocated an average of $28 million annually to the federal agencies that administer the program. It also received a $183 million investment in 2021 thanks to federal pandemic recovery funds. Of course, an incoming Trump administration could change things, and it's unclear how much funding will continue. Even still, a lot of money has gone into trying to open stores in places that are food deserts, but the results are a mixed bag.
We did our best to determine through what is frankly like a glaring lack of data that they have about what the programs they're funding are doing. But we examined 24 stores across 18 states through the USDA program that received funding and found that 5 stores had already ceased operations. 5 had closed of the 24, 6 had yet to open. And some of the ones that haven't opened yet are still trying to open, but the amount of money that they needed has changed. It's grown as prices for everything have gone up. And so they're struggling to get the doors open. Some of them have sort of abandoned efforts and said, we actually cannot make this work. I think it just shows that the struggle is very intense to get these things open and then to keep them open.
So let me ask you the obvious question then. If grocery stores are opening in places that desperately need them, why do you think that they're not making it?
Most stores in rural areas and in urban distress areas are independent stores. And independent stores have been closing as corporate chains have been expanding. Some people would say, well, that's just the market working. But what that does is sort of like create a lot of winners and losers, right? Because if you're a community that gets the regional Walmart or Kroger, it's probably pretty good for your community. But that means like a lot of other places see their stores fold because they cannot compete on prices. And so people are choosing to drive with it, which is understandable, right? Like you could try to shame people into saying, well, you had to support your local store. And I think they want to, but if you have a pretty limited income, you can't blame people for trying to, stretch that and take care of their families, right? Like, so Walmart and Kroger and these chains have gotten bigger and bigger, taken up bigger shares of the grocery market in these regions. And that's what forced them out in the first place. And so if you don't address those market conditions, those stores, of course, are going to still struggle. Money to open them up isn't money to sustain them.
Right. It's the irony, I guess, of it all, the unfortunate irony that these larger stores forced out competition in the smaller grocery stores. But people are willing to drive to the larger stores 30 miles away because they have lower prices.
Right. If you don't address the root cause of the problem, a few $100,000 to help open a store and come over the hurdles to opening it isn't going to make a difference in the long run.
Can we go back to the example of Rise and just how this is all played out there? This is the community grocery store in Cairo. How has it gone for that store since it opened a little over a year ago?
People were very excited to have the store open, but within months, I would say, and that, again, that's what was so shocking to me, is that the downturn happened almost immediately. And there were a number of things that happened. At first, it was that going back a few years, U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth had, as part of overall efforts to get more amenities to the town, reached out to Dollar General Corporation and said, can you put a fresh market into your one or both of your Dollar Generals in Cairo? And they said at the time, that's not our plan. And then when the grocery store opened, though, just literally at the same time, both Dollar Generals closed down for a little while, remodeled and opened, one of them adding a row of fresh produce, both of them expanding their fridge and freezer section. So yeah, that seems like kind of a kick in the gut to the community because they had asked them to do that, right? And they said no, and they literally reopened like the same week, maybe like within a day or two. So that happened. And then after that, they had a hot food cafe that they wanted to open because there's only one other restaurant in town. And so they wanted a place where people could come in, right, and congregate for seniors to have a community center and a lunch spot. But the cafe was just, it bled a lot of money. Like it was expensive to operate. And so that kind of put them a little bit upside down on their finances early on as well. And then they had a cooler breakdown, a big cooler, like a walk-in cooler for extra milk and meats and things like that. And they had bought it used because they were really like pinching pennies to get this thing open, and it broke. And that was like a $25,000 ordeal to replace it and have it installed. And they just didn't have that money.
By this point, Cairo residents had started drifting back to bigger, cheaper stores, the Dollar General, the Walmart, even if they were further away.
It's cyclical, right? So like the less people were coming in and spending money, the less money they had to stock the shelves. Then you would come in and it would look pretty, barren, and people would lose confidence, and just more and more people stopped coming in, which made it really hard for them to keep the things that were bringing people in. It was a double-edged sword in that way. And so in December, I remember, like I said, sitting down with the store manager, Robert, who was doing everything he could to keep it open. And he later told me that things were very dire.
When we come back, how big stores started pushing out local community grocers in the first place.
This episode is brought to you by Discover. It's always nice to get more for less. So here's a life hack that can automatically put some extra cash in your pocket. Discover will automatically double all the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. So you could get some money for this holiday season and get more next holiday season. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. This episode is brought to you by Discover. It's always nice to get more for less. So here's a life hack that can automatically put some extra cash in your pocket. Discover will automatically double all the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. So you could get some money for this holiday season and get more next holiday season. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
It might seem like an inevitability that big businesses like Walmart would drive smaller grocery stores out of business, but that's actually a relatively new phenomenon. Until about 40 years ago, the federal government rigorously enforced something called the Robinson-Patman Act. It's a 1930s-era law that barred suppliers from cutting special deals with big retailers and not independent stores. By the 1980s, however, some economists argued that letting big retailers negotiate favorable deals would benefit everyone. Congress never repealed the Robinson-Patman Act, but regulators began looking the other way.
It's actually not even being enforced at all. So starting in the 70s and then really into the 80s and beyond, the theory became that really we shouldn't be limiting the growth of these big companies, that bigger could mean more efficient and actually drive down prices. And I was reading when the Department of Justice made this opinion in the late 70s, they said that, sure, they acknowledged the concerns of the other side that eventually these companies that they could lower costs immediately, but that eventually they could get so large that they drive others out, and that then nothing would stop them from rising prices, right? But at the time, the DOJ said, well, we don't think that'll happen. But I think if you look back, ahead 40 years to where we are now, that some of that definitely is happening.
So basically, once big businesses were able to get special deals with wholesalers and retailers, they were able to undercut smaller stores, which I'm imagining had something to do with the creation of food deserts in the first place.
Right. And no one's saying, oh, you have to drive these chains out, but they're just trying to argue that there could be some leveling of the playing field, that if you did start to enforce this requirement that, these suppliers can't just pick and choose the winners and losers over how much they're charging the goods that land on the grocery store shelves, that independent stores could have at least a better fighting chance.
Yeah. You cited a USDA report from just last year that showed that 4 grocery store chains account for a third of U.S. food sales right now. That's a big shift.
It's a big shift, and that's what that USDA report was about. And the shift has happened largely in rural and mid-sized markets.
Could you spell out for me why having smaller grocery stores matter? Because why not incentivize bigger chains that can offer lower prices to open in communities like Cairo? Because I feel like people in that town would be pretty happy if there were a Walmart closer to them.
Yeah. And, it's not a far-fetched question, because when you look at this issue, some experts that I talked to said, it's silly to open a grocery store because people on limited incomes in a place like this are going to be forced to either, not shop there, or they're going to pay more if they do shop there. And there's no question that independent stores charge more. They don't have a choice. They do work, like Cairo, for instance, works with a wholesaler that out of Indiana that buys in bulk from suppliers to try to get those deals based on volume. But the Rise manager was telling me, is like, the truth is I could go to Walmart and get certain things at their already marked up price on the shelf cheaper than what he gets it initially, right? So it's not like these independent stores are trying to hike up the price because they need to make more money or it's really about the amount that they get it for from their wholesaler through the supplier. So, I think that there are people who say, well, given this, would it make more sense to use that money to, like you said, incentivize corporations to come into distressed communities, if they even would? But you're not going to have Walmart open a store in every community, right? Like, they're just not, because it's not their business model. They're regionalized. Like, they look at a map and say, like, okay, if we locate in this town, I'm going to draw from these 6 communities, right? So this is just not in their business model to even operate in every town. And it doesn't make sense, I don't think, to pay them to do that.
So what can be done to help small stores stay open? Or is there another better way to address the grocery gap?
There are advocates on one side who are pushing for, we had to address the root causes. Again, that's like reinforcing things like Robinson-Patman and slowing the continued growth of chains.
There had been some movement on this during Biden's presidency. The FTC was specifically looking into the impact of grocery store consolidation on food deserts. And FTC Chair Lena Khan announced the agency was planning on bringing back enforcement of the Robinson-Patman Act. But it seems unlikely these efforts will continue under the Trump administration.
And then it seems like the other big thing that you might see happen, I mean, it does seem to be that there's this like reckoning that this isn't working. And so there's some communities in Kansas where the government is saying, we'll buy the grocery store. Either they'll manage it with city employees or they'll subcontract it out. But basically acknowledging that the store may take years to break even, and even then may, from time to time continue to need subsidies. So to me, those are the kind of 2 big options, right? You address the market conditions that make it almost impossible for independent stores to compete, or you subsidize them over the long term. Otherwise, probably most of them aren't going to make it in the long term, or many of them.
Something I found interesting about your story was that it seemed to suggest that for small communities, a grocery store isn't just a grocery store. And I'd like to return to Rise, which is still open. Could you tell me how that store is doing right now and what it's sort of meant for a place like Cairo to have a store like Rise?
Yeah, to answer the first part of your question first, the store is open. So it was in a really difficult spot into the early part of this year. It did get a private grant. It had received some private funding to open and then received the second half of that promised grant. And there's some restrictions on how the funds could be used, but it allowed them to free up some other money where they could, pay off their electric bill and get some bills they had kind of pushed back, paid off. And then they started restocking the store. So it does look better. But the store needs to make $70,000 a month to break even, right? These are just ballpark figures. Of course, it's going to fluctuate month to month, but on average, and they're making a less than 30 right now. So once that private money runs out in a year or so, again, you're back in the same predicament unless they can more than double their current sales, which is a lot to ask of a small town. It's not an insignificant amount. So that's where they are right now.
That's a big gap.
It's a big gap. Yeah. But you ask, what it's meant for the town. And I still think it's very important to the town. And that's maybe the harder part to explain. It's like, well, maybe it's not important to them if they're not shopping there. But I don't think that's like an entirely fair analysis because, again, there are some people who do rely on it entirely because they cannot travel. It's a source of employment. It's a source of hope. It's a community center. This place is, I thought this was so great. Somebody had their wedding reception there. They've had, health expos and community events and meetings are hosted there because there's not a lot of other places to just sort of, congregate. Seniors meet up there and have lunch, that might otherwise be isolated. So there's just like a lot of things this store does. This is a full service community center. It's not just a grocery store.
Molly, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Molly Parker is an investigative reporter for Capital News Illinois and a local reporting network fellow at ProPublica. That's the show. If you're a fan of What Next, the best way to support our work is to join Slate Plus. Go to slate.com/whatnextplus to sign up. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. We're led by Alicia Montgomery with a little help from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Yasmin Khan. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.
When you're part of a military family, you understand sacrifice and support. So at American Public University, we honor your dedication by extending our military tuition savings to your extended family. Parents, spouses, legal partners, siblings, and dependents all qualify for APU's preferred military rate of just $250 per credit hour for undergraduate and master's level programs. American Public University. Value for the whole family. Learn more at apu.apus.edu/military.